What is it like to have been a close confidant of Stokely Carmichael? What kind of a revolutionary was Stokely? What it is that motivated the fearlessness that the world came to know? We will get the answers to these and other questions as we continue our series on the life and times of Stokely Carmichael. A conversation with Charlie Cobb and Bob Brown, two of Kwame's comrades-in-Arms. That's our show today. Don't go anywhere. Carib Nation is up next. Welcome to Carib Nation. I'm David Hines. I'm always excited whenever I get the opportunity to talk to people who've been in the trenches fighting for their people's livelihood and betterment. In the studio today, as we continue our series on the life and times of Stokely Carmichael, also known as Kwame Toure, I have here two of his comrades-in-arms. I'm talking about Mr. Charlie Cobb and Mr. Bob Brown. Gentlemen, welcome to Carib Nation.
Thank you for inviting us.
And let's start at the beginning, as they say. And when did you first meet Stokely?
At Howard, when I entered Howard in 1962. Stokely was a year ahead of me, but we were both involved with the sit-in movement.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
And so you met him in the context of politics?
Yeah, I met him very specifically in the context of him being a freedom rider and having served 49 days in Parchment Penitentiary, just as I was becoming involved in the sit-in movement.
Mm-hmm. Bob, your first contact with Stokely?
I met him in the spring of 1967 when he came to speak in Chicago at the University of Chicago, accompanied by Cleve Sellers and Eldridge Cleaver, who had just gotten out of jail and wasn't really known at that point. Mm-hmm. And we've had a relationship since then. Let's talk about that first, because you met him when he came there to speak. And Stokely Carmichael was obviously one of the great communicators, orators of our time. I read a piece, and CLR James rates him way up there as one who can communicate people's feelings and communicate his ideas. What that first speech, try to recount it for us. Well, I don't so much remember the speech at the University of Chicago, but before he went to the speech, we were part of the nationalist youth movement in Chicago, and we were extremely upset that he was coming to Chicago to talk to the white folks and had not come to the ghetto to talk to us. So about 100 of us got together and we went to the airport. We commandeered him. We said, okay, you must come speak to us first. And we took him to a basement of a group called ACT. A former SNCC member named Lawrence Landry was the leader of it, Dick Gregory, Adam Clayton Powell, and we were the Chicago chapter. And we were frankly cussing him. And he convinced us that not only did we stop cussing him, we immediately agreed to become his bodyguards and go motorcade over to the University of Chicago and stand around looking ugly and black power at the white folks while he spoke. And that it became clear that he communicated with and he recruited both groups of people. Because in the support movement in the base in Chicago, you have many of the youth who were part of that original group that were cussing him, and you also have a large number of the white population who were students at the university at that point in time. Let me press you on a little bit here before we go back to Charlie, because you raised the issue there that Stokely went to speak to white folks and that he recruited white people. But he had a kind of, if you will, a kind of a love-hate relationship in terms of the role of white people in black struggle. Talk a little bit about that. No, that's a myth. Uh-huh. There's an industry in this country which has perpetuated a whole set of myths, and that's one of them. If you look at Kwame, at least since I've known him from the 1970s, when I used to go on the road with him to the 1987, the overwhelming majority of Kwame's audiences have always been white.
So did he have a problem with whites playing leading roles in the black struggle?
In the
I
black
guess that's my struggle. That's my question.
In the black struggle, what they say is that Kwame put white folks out the movement. This is nonsense. The movement is the people. You cannot put the people out of the people. That what he said then and what we have maintained is that white folks need organizing. White folks need education. Poor white people, racist white people, other people. And that it is better for white organizers to go to the white community and organize their own people to unite with us. There are a whole host of white people who were in SNCC and CORE and other movements at that point in time who took that position. And they went into the peace movement, they went into the labor movement, they went into the Irish Republican Solidarity movement, and we have maintained consistent contact with those people, those group of people, up to this day.
Charlie, let me bring you in here and be getting back to Howard and the early days of the freedom rides and so on. What was Kwame's role in those early, what was his perspective? Was he as radical as he turned out to be later on? Talk a little bit about those early years.
Well, Kwame was certainly radical for what Howard was in 1961 and 1962.
Okay.
And remember, Kwame didn't, or Stokely, didn't spring full-blown out of his mother's womb as a revolutionary articulating Pan-Africanism. There was a process that shaped him. I mean, part of it, I think you hear from his mother in terms of her description of him at home and the home values in life. Another part of that process was Howard, which in 1960s Washington, D.C. was very much a Southern school, very much a center of black intellectual and political thought, and there were a lot of influences acting on him, including students who were activists and protesting. Kwame told me, you know, he was ambivalent about the sit-ins, although like all of us who were kind of teenagers then, you're struck by these people your own age taking an action against segregation and white supremacy. And you got this kind of ambivalence about the nonviolent part of it. And in New York, he hadn't had a chance to really interact with these students, say as a 12th grader in high school. And Kwame said he came to Washington really to participate in a protest against the House Un-American Activities Committee.
That's Joseph McCarthy.
Joe McCarthy's committee, and that participating in this demonstration were a group from Howard University who were also involved in sit-ins and protesting along. Washington was segregated along Route 40 in Maryland and the Eastern Shore and these kinds of places. So he got a chance to interact in a way that he hadn't been able to interact in New York with people, and that pulls him in. And in less than a year, he now is participating in the freedom rides, and again, he's now meeting students from all across the South. He's 49 days in Parchment Penitentiary as a result of the freedom ride. He does not come straight back to New York after release from prison. He meets students from Nashville, Tennessee. There's a whole political discussion happening among students in the South, which Stokely becomes a part of, and his ideas get sharpened. And I don't want to take a lot of time with this, I just would make one last point, that Stokely said probably Bayard Rustin's name has to be mentioned in this context. I remember Stokely telling me once, Stokely knew some of the white leftists in New York, and he had a problem with them in the sense the way they backed away from the racial questions. And then he said he heard at some meeting Bayard Rustin take on all of these people and kind of defeat them intellectually. And Stokely said, well, who is that? And somebody says, that's Bayard Rustin. Stokely says, I want to be like him. And it's clearly an influence here, his involvement with Bayard's Youth March on Washington as kind of a volunteer. And later, of course, with all the Howard students, because I was there, Bayard was an important intellectual
and
influence.
of course, Bayard Rustin was, as they say, the man behind the scenes in the civil rights movement, very close to Dr. Martin Luther King, I understand, as a supreme strategist, understood the pulse of the movement.
It was Bayard that put together the working papers that led to the formation of SCLC, which was Dr. King's organization.
Mm-hmm.
Bayard had been very instrumental in some of the organizational work around the Montgomery bus boycott,
Mm-hmm.
which happened before the sit-ins.
Let's move from Washington and go down to Mississippi. Very important period in Stokely's development, and you were there.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about that experience. How that experience down there shaped the Stokely Carmichael that we came to know.
Well, I think, one, the point has to be made again, that he came there in a certain kind of way, not only in the sense of having to protest white supremacy, but he came there prepared to listen and learn from people. I think that has something to do with home life, too. Mm-hmm. The key thing to understand, in my view, about Stokely and Mississippi, or Stokely and the South, which would include Lowndes County, Alabama, as well as Mississippi, is Stokely the organizer. You know, I think in some ways the civil rights movement is misread a bit because it's often defined entirely in terms of mass protests. The Selma to Montgomery March, or the March on Washington, or Birmingham, or any of the other large demonstrations. And I think Dr. King has come to symbolize this kind of image of the civil rights movement as mass protests. But at another level, the civil rights movement operated as a movement of grassroots organizing, less visible, less dramatic, and in a lot of ways more difficult. Trudging up and down dirt roads, country roads, looking over your shoulder for the Ku Klux Klan or the White Citizens Council, you know, the arrests, the beatings, and the jailings and all that. And Stokely, I mean, I think it's impossible to understand Stokely Carmichael without understanding the organizing, without understanding the work deep down in the grassroots
and
that he was involved in.
Of course, until his very last days, whenever he speak, he would always say, organize, organize. Bob, let's jump to Black Power, because Stokely will be remembered by many things, but mostly by his clarion call for Black Power. Talk a little bit about what Stokely actually meant by Black Power, because lots of people will tell you all kinds of things. It was a racist call, it was violent, and so forth. From your perspective, as someone who was there, who was at Stokely's side, what he meant by Black Power?
I think, first of all, you should understand that Kwame knew that he or Mukasa Willie Ricks were not the first to cry for Black Power.
Right.
Frederick Douglass did a speech in 1898 called The Doom of Black Power. Mm-hmm. Richard Wright had written a book about Ghana, the independence, in 1957 called Black Power. Adam Clayton Powell had organized a Black Power conference at Howard University a year before the call for Black Power. So I think, first of all, Kwame knew his place in a continuum. He didn't often speak about it, but for example, one of the last things we talked about before he left the country to go back to Guinea was the need to do the true history, which we talked about earlier, of Henry Sylvester Williams and George Padmore and C.L.R. James and Kwame, as four people that not only the Caribbean produced, but Trinidad produced. Each of these four people making a contribution to the World Pan-African movement and the World Socialist movement. So first, he was very clear in terms of his role and place in history. He saw the need for power. Clearly, the problems that he had faced, the confrontations he had had, the contributions he had made inside the civil rights movement, the jailings, the poverty of the people, clearly was powerlessness. And he stripped through all the rhetoric about integration and all the rhetoric about separation and said Black Power. I think that because he was an organizer, because he connected to the people, because his background was philosophy, he could reduce the people suffering and striving to a couple of words. One of the best sloganeers. In fact, him and I sometimes, we had it out over the slogans. He'd reduce everything to a slogan. Sometime I thought it was more complex than that. But that slogan captured the imagination of people, not just in Mississippi, where it was clearly a question of power, where we were shown our powerlessness at the Democratic Convention in 1964, where they just ignored us and went on because they had an agenda to elect Humphrey and to elect Johnson, that this struggle reverberated all around the world. I mean, it spread rapidly in the North. It spread rapidly throughout, you know, India, throughout Europe, throughout Asia. I mean, you even had little Japanese kids running around throwing their fists up, screaming Black Power. And I think it's because he spoke to the needs of people worldwide.
Charlie, you want to jump in and comment on the Black Power phenomenon?
Yeah, it was logical. After Atlantic City, which Bob was just talking about in 1964, in which basically the Democratic Party, or the political establishment of the Democratic Party, turned its back on the people in Mississippi. I mean, it just became clear that what you were organizing for was really the right to make the decisions that affected your lives, the right to control your own life, power. And that's what he
had some differences with his colleagues in SNCC in particular, and the civil rights movement in general. Were those differences ideological? Were they tactical?
SNCC wasn't particularly ideological, so the differences weren't ideological in my view. I think the differences weren't significant. There was a broad difference in the civil rights movement. The real distinction, I think, and this in some ways is an oversimplification you have to make about the civil rights movement, was what I was talking about earlier. Whether or not the movement would be hierarchical and built around the idea of a single leader in that hierarchical organization, or whether the movement would be a grassroots movement. That was a conflict, a difference that was never really resolved inside the civil rights movement. And I think Stokely leaned toward the latter. Stokely always talked about grassroots organizing, and that really wasn't much of a debate inside SNCC. The reason Stokely went to Alabama was there was a difference that's important. When the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party decided after the Atlantic City Convention to continue to attempt to be a part of the National Democratic Party, the Mississippi Democrat, Stokely disagreed with that. He thought that you should have an independent black political party. He did not want to fight with the MFDP over this, so he chose to go to Lowndes County, Alabama, where ultimately he helped organize the Lowndes County Freedom Organization in Lowndes County. And that's, again, another complicated story.
Go ahead, Charlie.
Bob.
Oh, sorry, Bob.
I beg to differ
Go right ahead.
The problems were ideological.
The problems in SNCC.
In SNCC. And Kwame and I talked about this in the latter part often. He did not choose to make the differences public because he did not want the police and other forces to manipulate the contradictions. But they were genuine, deep-rooted sets of values. Kwame disagreed with the capitalist economic and political system inside the United States government, and deliberately and consciously chose not to integrate into it. His refusal to continue pre-med at Howard University and become part of the Howard University elite, his insistence on going to work with the people of Mississippi, when he could have been a doctor, he could have been the Prime Minister of Trinidad, he could have been anything, is at root an ideological set of values and whatnot. That there were tremendous differences which people kept to a minimum. I mean, the differences over 64 in the approach of the Democratic Party took to how to resolve the contradiction can clearly be seen 4 or 5 years later, when an overwhelming majority of SNCC people had moved into the Democratic Party, were beginning to run for elected offices, were working in presidential campaigns, and Kwame chose to remain out in the cold.
Any big differences with Dr. King?
Yes, Kwame had major differences with Dr. King.
Talk about it.
Ideological. Dr. King came out, or at least was trained in the movement with Bayard Rustin and other forces who saw non-violence as a principle, as an ideology. John Lewis took that position and still takes it when you read some of his books and not. Whereas other folks saw non-violence as a tactic. If it worked, you use it. If it don't work, you find something else you do by any means necessary. And this was a major principle question. Even and especially after Dr. King was given the Nobel Peace Prize. If at any point prior to that he had wanted to retreat, because he wasn't nonviolent all of his life, he had guns in Alabama, in his house, in Montgomery, in 57. And Bayard Rustin came down and asked him to take the guns out and keep it nonviolent. But once King was locked in with the Peace Prize, he could not retreat. In fact, it's because King was so, strong on it, that we could push King to come out against the war in Vietnam. Because King did not come out against the war in Vietnam until forces in SNCC, forces in youth. I remember when King came to Chicago one time, and again, being as arrogant as youth as we always were, we would not let King speak. We just stood for 1 hour while he tried to speak, screaming, "We want black power, we want black power, we want black power." And he finally took us to the basement, and we moved it quickly, and asked, "What's the problem? What do you want?" And we said, "We want you to tell us to be nonviolent in Vietnam like you're asking us to be nonviolent in this country." And he had to come out for it. So these were major ideological differences.
Okay. I think if, in that sense, if you, the kinds of differences Bob talked about, those are real differences. I don't think they break down. I think where we differ is, I don't think they break down in terms of organizations.
Okay.
See, I don't see that as a, I think you take the whole movement. The movement is like all movements. It ranges across, on literally a linear political scale. If you look at the whole movement, I think then, yes, you can certainly say there are differences between people who are committed to America, capitalism, bourgeois existence, et cetera, et cetera. I think they do not. I don't think you can get at them by looking at them in terms of organizations, or you're limited. I mean, you could certainly describe SCLC as an organization of Southern ministers, and that has very specific cultural meaning in the United States. And you can certainly look at SNCC and say an organization of black Southern students has very, but when you look at what the differences are, grassroots organizations versus some other kind of organization, how radical are you going to be? I think organizations don't help you. In that sense, the fact that Stokely was chairman of SNCC is not very helpful to understanding where Stokely came out politically.
And he moved on and became a member of the Black Panther Party and had some differences there. What happened? And that's one of the periods of Stokely's career that much is not written about, I think.
Well, we should first understand, and he would want us to be very clear, he was an honorary prime minister of the Black Panther Party, not a real prime minister. He never wanted to be on the Central Committee of the Panther Party.
Okay.
He made a commitment to Huey Newton and other forces to help build the party. And as he moved around the country in some of his major last recruitment drives and speaking tours, every place he went, if you asked him, like I did, what do you want me to do? Build the Black Panther Party. So he was critical in, our forces were critical in organizing most of the key early chapters of the Black Panther Party outside of Oakland, California. In fact, the party was not a real party, it was a movement. You had 17 organizations fighting each other in Oakland, California the night that Huey Newton went to jail. And Huey didn't have 7 people in his organization. But because people like Kwame, people like Jamil, formerly known as Rap Brown, people like Jim Foreman, other organizations, the Communist Party worldwide adopted them. And Huey, as a cause, he was elevated up, and the party sprang. in less than 16 months from 7 people to 5,000 people. We had problems from the beginning, again ideological. When we came into the Panther Party, it was a progression of nationalism to Pan-Africanism. And in fact, Kwame moved to Guinea at a critical point when we were organizing the party. And for example, everybody who came into our wing of the Panther Party had to have an African name that you kept quiet so the police wouldn't know about it and whatnot. But all of a sudden that shifted. A second problem was we were very successful in recruiting among the youth groups in this country. I mean, in Chicago alone, we were negotiating with the 4 top youth groups in that town, over 15, 20,000 young people with guns. We were on the verge of merging. But as these people came in, they did not change their street values, their criminality, their corruption. And it became more and more embedded inside of the organization, such that political differences, rather than being discussed out and voted out and studied out, became intimidation and threatening. And that's one of the major reasons that Kwame uses in his resignation, that they had begun to intimidate and to threaten and to use all of these lumpen proletariat
Our
tactics.
time is going and we've not even gotten halfway in the journey yet. Quickly, in 30 seconds, what would you say is Stokely Carmichael's lasting legacy?
I think the idea of organizing, consistent, sustained organizing, which is an idea that's easy to lose, is elevated again in Stokely's life.
Bob?
I think Charlie is correct, organization, but also the necessity for mass political education and the role that youth, especially students, must play in that.
Gentlemen, we've not touched on the AARP, we have not touched on some of the later works of Stokely Carmichael. You'll have to come back for us to do another part in this program. But for now, I want to thank you for coming in, sharing your thoughts with us here. It's really been my pleasure. It's one of my passions to examine the lives and contributions of those men and women who, by their leadership, helped to shape the world's destiny. It is especially satisfying to me when those persons are of Caribbean and African heritage. Kwame Toure, Stokely Carmichael, by any account, must qualify as one of the foremost leaders of the 20th century. May his life and example serve as a tool in the continued struggle of the oppressed peoples of the world for justice, liberty, and freedom. Hail up, Stokely. We love you. Until the next time, this is David Hines, thanking you for tuning in to yet another edition of Carib Nation. And remember, as always, our motto here is one people, one culture, one Caribbean, one nation. And as always, rally around the West Indies.